Okay, so for this next part, right, I want to go through one question. So, just to bring out all the skills that I've already went through, as well as some new stuff. Okay, so the question I'm going to go through is the 2021 VJC promo exam question number 3. Okay, so if you want, you can go back and scan the QR code. Just go on the cohort site, download this promo exam question, and then you can just make notes beside it. Okay, yeah. So again, it's VJC, it's 2021's paper, question number 3. Okay, so this question gives you a preamble, right? Tell you 2020 investment in fixed capital formation in Singapore totaled 100.9 billion. So what exactly is this? So investment in fixed capital formation basically means capital means machines lah, right? So there's a difference between capital and consumption. So for capital is a type of good. It's a type of good. Sorry, it's a type of spending on something that can be used to produce something else, right? So consumption is something like a chocolate bar. So it gives you direct utility. Chocolate bars cannot be used to produce something else. Capital is something that can be used to produce something else. So machines are an example of capital. Factories are an example of capital, right? So fixed capital just means that the capital cannot move lah, right? So if you set up a factory, you can't really move the factory here and there. So that's called fixed capital formation. Okay, so they say investment which is spending on this fixed capital formation total 100.9 billion, making up 21.5% of GDP. Okay, so this is just a preamble. So then I ask you, can you discuss whether economic growth will always lead to a higher standard of living for residents in the country? So this is a 15-mark question. So 15-mark questions are 10 plus 5, right? So 5 marks is evaluation, right? So evaluation can come either from the in-body evaluations that you will do, okay, or it can come from the conclusion. Either one are possible lah, right? And then the 10 marks is made out of an R1 and an R2, right? Okay, so what's R1 and R2? So they ask you whether economic growth will always lead to a higher standard of living. So then R1 would just the way I like to construct R1 and R2s is I just like to take it at face value, right? So I don't like to like sort of move things around or try to interpret it anyway. I just want to take at face value what is the question asking me for. So at face value, it's just asking you, does economic growth always lead to an increase in the standard of living of residents, right? So then this is my R1, right? And then because it's a discuss whether, so you just need to flip the other way, right? So R2, e.g., always you just change to may not always lead to an increase in SOL. Okay, yeah. So R1 is this, R2 is this. So this will make up our 10 marks, and then we'll see whether it's appropriate to have any in-body evaluations. If not, then we'll just put everything in the conclusion. Okay, so we're going to start off first with what the answer is talking about. So this is what I said. So R1 and R2, right? For R1 and R2 construction, like what I said, I always like to take it at face value. So can lead, may not lead to higher SOL for residents in the country, and then your starting point being growth lah. Okay, so teachers are quite ambivalent about whether you should write an intro or not, right? So personally for me, I'm not that hung up on it. So if you write an intro, you don't write an intro, to me it's not really a big deal. But for SOL questions, I take a different position, right? So for SOL questions, I actually think it's very helpful to define. And the reason why is because SOL consists of both material and non-material. So it's to make sure that you yourself cover material and non-material points lah. So that's why I always, for SOL questions, I take an exception. I prefer that you'd have a very short intro just to define what SOL is lah. Right. So SOL has two components. There's a material component, which is influenced by the consumption of goods and services. So the MSOL component is very, very one-dimensional. If I have 2 chocolate bars and you have 1, I'm better off than you, right? So it's just gauged solely by the consumption of goods and services. The non-material SOL refers to the qualitative stuff. So quantitative means you can count. Qualitative means like you can't really count, like how is this person's character better than this other person. You can't really count that, right? But you can count the person's UAS score, right? So non-material is like the character part of it, right? So it's very intangible, right? So it includes things like leisure, life expectancy, cleanliness, a clean or stress-free environment. So all that will count under your non-material as well. Okay, so questions. So whenever I put a tick here, it's like a mental habit or a skill associated with SOL lah. So for me, I feel SOL questions is just helpful to define. Okay. Okay, so let's get on to the R1 proper, which is, economic growth, let's change it to green, can lead to higher SOL for residents in the country. Okay, so when there's higher economic growth, it means that the GDP is increasing, right? Okay, so I placed this in blue because it's not inside the answer key. So if you download the answer key from the cohort site, this blue section is not there. So can you please add that in the answer key? Okay, because last year, Cambridge said in their report that they wanted students to write this, so I'm going to edit it a little bit lah. Okay, so if there's a rise in economic, if there's economic growth, it means GDP is rising, right? If economic growth means that the GDP number, the GDP growth rate, is in percentage terms, this is positive. So if it's more than zero, it means there's a rise in GDP. Okay, so if the rise in GDP exceeds your population growth, right? So what you're doing is you're growing the pie very, very quickly, faster than the number of people sharing into the pie, right? So then this leads to a rise in GDP per capita, which is the amount of pie each person has lah, right? So if there's a rise in GDP per capita, it means that people can consume more goods and services, right? And what's the reason why they're able to do that? Because they have more purchasing power. Oh, they do have the word purchasing power here. Okay, can you add the word purchasing power here? And then we'll have to have, maybe just add it somewhere lah. So just make sure you have this technical term, purchasing power. Okay, this is also a technical term, so you want to make sure that you write this down. Okay, so with a higher GDP per capita, each household will now have more purchasing power. So then you can consume more goods and services, which is here. Right. So if you have higher GDP, you have higher purchasing power, then you're able to consume more goods and services. This will lead to a rise in material standard of living. Okay, so I'll write it down here again. So what is it? So if GDP, it must exceed the population growth. Right. Then if so, the GDP per capita will rise. Right. Then if so, the purchasing power rises, allows people to consume more goods and services, and then finally, your material standard of living will increase. Okay, so this is how GDP leads to an increase in material standard of living. Okay, next part. Second part would be how GDP growth can lead to an increase in non-material standard of living. Okay, but here I wanna clarify a couple of things. So the point I'm gonna write here is less important than the one before that, which is this. Okay, so if you have no time in the exam, I really want you to prioritize this slide instead of the other slide, but I will go through the other slide. Okay, and again, for this slide, I really want to stress this, that really technical terms are very important. Okay, so all the stuff here in this yellow highlight you should have. Okay, but let's say you have time, right? So let's say you have time and you want to do well. If you want to do well, you want to make sure that you err on the side of writing a little bit more. So what can you do? So you say, okay, I've already covered how GDP increases can lead to an increase in material standard of living. Is there a way to get me to non-material standard of living? And there is actually, right? So when there's higher GDP growth, firstly, the tax revenue of the government will increase. Okay, why? Because there are two types of taxes that will increase when GDP growth increases. And that is firstly, corporate taxes. And secondly, income taxes. Maybe I shouldn't put taxes, but tax revenue, the money that the government collects. Right. So if there's higher GDP growth, companies are making more profits, and corporate taxes take a slice of that. So if your profits increase, then I'll take a larger slice of it. So that's why the government tax revenue from this source will increase, right? And so when the GDP growth also likewise, workers tend to take home more income. And again, the government will take a slice of that. So for example, the government can take away 12% of that or 10% of that. Right? So if you make $1,000, the government takes away 10%, the government has $100 revenue. But suddenly if there's growth and your income is now $2,000, then now the government has $200 lah. Right? So then your tax revenue will increase as well. There's actually one more source of tax revenue that increases, which is consumption taxes. Right? Like even things like GST tax revenue, you also will rise in periods of growth just because people spend more. Okay, so with that, the government has more firepower, right? They have more tax revenue. Okay, so with this tax revenue, you want to make sure that you skew your answer in a way that allows you to increase the non-material standard of living. So you can say, hey, why don't the government spend on, with the increased tax revenue, the government can spend on things like parks and gardens. So for example, building park connectors in Singapore as well. Okay, to improve the quality of life, right? Greenery also helps to mitigate poorer air quality, right? So you want to plant trees, or have gardens near very congested highways. You help mitigate the poor air quality. Maybe block out some of the noise as well, right? So it leads to higher non-material as well. Okay. With resources, you can also build better schools, right? And literacy levels will also rise. So this kind of spending by the government on public goods and merit goods will help to increase the non-material standard of living of the residents as well. Okay. Okay, so just to recap a little bit, what's my R1? Okay, so in R1, let's use orange. In R1, I needed to link economic growth to material standard of living, and if I have time, because this point it takes priority, right? If I have time and want to do well, I write the non-material aspect as well, right? So for the material aspect, you want to make sure that you write that it's higher than population growth, right? And that increases GDP per capita, right? And it increases purchasing power and the amount of goods and services that people can buy. Okay, again, I want to stress these are technical terms. Okay, in SOL questions, especially for the TCs, technical terms are very, very important. Okay, for the non-material aspect, we go through, let's use black. Okay, so for non-material aspect, we go through tax revenue. Right, so the government will receive more tax revenue in an environment where the macro growth is very, very good. Right, and with the tax revenue, they can spend on building parks, greenery, schools, all of which will help to improve the quality of life of citizens. So my R1 will consist of doing this arrow, which is the priority again, and then doing this arrow if we have time.